Welcome aboard Pink Monorail. I'm your pilot, Michelle Valladolid, and with me is my co-pilot, Noe Valladolid.
Hey, everybody.
On our last trip, we visited the Exposition Universelle de Paris 1889, which gave the world the Eiffel Tower. What could top that? What if we made it spin?
Now that's a great way to get somebody's attention.
America's answer to the Paris Exposition of 1889 would be to celebrate an important milestone in America. Columbus sailed the deep blue sea in 1493.
Okay, but that was not the year this happened. This was 400 years after this happened?
Well, no. Columbus didn't sail the deep blue sea in 1493. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. But it took an extra year to build the exposition, and so they had it in 1893.
Okay. So they had to change the song just
So
for
they
the
had
expo.
to change the poem just for the exposition. So if you get confused and you hear the other poem, as I did when I was a child and didn't know where it came from, that's where it came from. Why then was the exposition a year late, and why is it tied with the 1964 World's Fair as the greatest World's Fair of all time?
Probably because it was the greatest World's Fair of all time.
And what does it have to do with Disney and theme parks?
Let's find out.
Let's find out. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. In the late 1880s, people in the U.S. started talking about throwing an expo there to celebrate the 400th anniversary of what they thought was Columbus discovering America. It had been discovered several times previously.
Yeah, technically those don't count according to the old history books.
I see. I was wondering what with the Vikings and the Chinese.
Yeah, or the native peoples that had been on this land for thousands and thousands and thousands of years would say about being discovered.
They walked across an ice bridge that is no longer here from Asia. So yeah, kind of hard to discover something that was already discovered tens of thousands of years before you discovered it. And also, he didn't discover North America. He discovered the Caribbean.
Yeah, well, Columbus is a clown for many reasons, but this expo was pretty amazing. Apologies to the clowns out there. I know you do actual work. I'll find a better word to use next time.
4 main contenders were New York City, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis. Chicago had recovered well from the Great Fire and was celebrating being named the second biggest city in the USA. New York had the transportation and lodging, and St. Louis was game to do just about anything organizers would want. Washington, D.C. didn't really have many backers, even though that was the capital. New York financiers J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and William Waldorf Astor vowed to spend $15 million on the fair if it was held in New York. Charles T. Yerkes, Marshall Field, Philip Armour, like Armour hot dogs and Armour...
Arm and Hammer?
No, like Armour Meats. In fact,
okay.
Armour Meats ran... No, Swift did. Yes. Gustavus Swift was one of the people who backed the Chicago. They had big businesses in the stockyards. And Swift, when Disneyland opened for the first couple years, almost the first 10 years, ran all of the restaurants at Disneyland. They ran the Red Wagon Inn, and they ran the Plantation Chicken restaurant. And then all the other restaurants in Disneyland had to get their meats from Armour.
So Big Money was having a war in between Chicago and New York as to who would be hosting this expo, and the Armour people.
Armour and Swift. As long as Marshall Field was a big department store. They bought Target about 20 years ago.
Okay.
The other one was Cyrus McCormick Jr. He offered to back a Chicago World's Fair as well. So they had all these famous old people. Like Astor died on the Titanic.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. Back to Swift. Swift's Chicken Plantation House was roughly where Pirates of the Caribbean is now, just a little bit east of there.
This is an actual place that existed before Disneyland.
No, this was in Disneyland.
Okay, so before Pirates of the Caribbean, there was a chicken house there.
There was a plantation chicken house, and the front of it looked like a plantation house, and the back of it was Mission Mexican style.
Oh, wow.
The front of it was copied when they knocked it down, And when you go on Pirates of the Caribbean, when you go through and see the Blue Bayou restaurant, that plantation house was remade on the inside.
Oh.
With the door upstairs that leads into Club 33. And then the patio where everyone eats. You're eating on the back patio of a beautiful mansion. The reason why Walt started this restaurant was because he loved Mrs. Knott's Chicken Dinner Restaurant, owned by his friend Walter Knott and his wife, Cordelia. If you go to Knott's Chicken Dinner Restaurant, you can actually see one of the guest books that he signed and some of his artists signed. Swift also ran the Red Wagon Inn and the Red Wagon Restaurant, which were the same thing. Some of the signs said Red Wagon Inn, and some of the signs said Red Wagon Restaurant. And the menu said Red Wagon Restaurant. They served meals like steak, turkey, and halibut for about $3.50, including salad, drink, and dessert. They had a children's menu with specialized art made by the Disney artists in animation. And some of this art I've never seen before. So it was made specially for the children's menu. And they even had baby food. You could get mash. Or ground, or you could get strained for really little babies. And you could get beef or veal. In the 50s, veal was very big in baby food.
Now, this is specifically the restaurant that they had opened in Disneyland.
Right. It's now the Plaza Inn.
Oh, wow.
When they changed it to the Plaza Inn, they sealed up the broaster in the kitchen. It was a little room in the back. A broasted chicken means to fry chicken under pressure. Pressure cook and fry chicken at the same time. And it makes it just incredible. If you've ever had the chicken at the Plaza Inn, it's incredible. But for about 40 years, it wasn't so good. I mean, it was good. It was fried chicken, and it was fried chicken. In 1998, when they were redoing the restaurant and redoing the back end of it, and redoing Tomorrowland, they uncovered the broaster in pristine condition.
They didn't even take it apart?
They didn't take it apart. It was clean. It just was aged. So they cleaned it up.
I hope they refurbished it a little.
It was as good as new, they said.
Wow.
They started making the broasted chicken, which they just call chicken. People think it's fried chicken. It's broasted chicken. And if you're at Disneyland, get some broasted chicken at the Plaza Inn. You won't be sorry, unless you're a vegetarian. There was also the Swift Market House, which is now Starbucks. And historians argue about whether or not you could buy meat there. I don't think you could buy raw meat and carry it around Disneyland, but like cold cuts,
right?
Possibly. Maybe they made sandwiches or something, but no one really.
I have a feeling they would make loose meat sandwiches there. I don't think they would sell the raw meat.
No, I don't think they would sell
But sandwiches would be a very lucrative thing, especially since it had a very classic picnic theme in Disneyland, and most families at the time, when they would visit gardens or parks, they would pack their own sandwiches, and those that didn't, they could just visit the little corner shop at Disneyland. I think it would make more sense to just have a sandwich there.
Next time the historians start arguing, I'm gonna come get you.
Okay.
So back to Chicago. Chicago banker Lyman Gage, future Secretary of the Treasury under William McKinley, and SEA member Theodore Roosevelt.
For those people that are new to the lingo, SEA, Society of Explorers and Adventurers.
After we're finished with Manufacturing the Magic, we're going to do a couple episodes on the SEA.
Okay.
He raised enough money to convince Congress to let Chicago have the fair. It took Congress 7 tries before they finally voted, because New York was being obstinate, but they finally got the fair, and Chicago held a day of celebration. They were like dancing in the streets and hitting pots and pans, and
it's a big thing. It's like when towns and cities are fighting for the Olympics or the World Cup, everybody's bidding, and when it gets announced, everybody celebrates. Especially then, because there were no World Cups, and the Olympics, the modern Olympiads, were still a couple of years off.
Once the fair was approved, they received additional financing from Charles Schwab. You've heard of Charles Schwab, right?
Yeah.
The broker.
They're still in business today.
John Whitfield Baum, and Connecticut banking and iron mogul Milo Barnum Richards. No relation to P.T. Barnum. Mark Twain called the era the Gilded Age. Industrial Revolution was in full swing. The fair brought together different classes of people at the same time. Unlike, remember when we talked about the Crystal Palace and how they had pricing for just the lords and ladies, and then they allowed the next lower class and then the lowest. It was 50 cents for adults, no matter who the adults were. On Chicago Day, on Negro Day,
On Manhattan Day.
there was no Manhattan. Chicago was considered the West of America, and it seems kind of odd now because it's back east.
Right.
But back then, it was the gateway to, well, St. Louis, Missouri was the gateway to the West, but it was a gateway to the West.
Right.
It was the last civilization before the Great Frontier. Now, earlier, just a few years earlier, they had declared the frontier closed. There was no free land left. Everybody owned it. Not everybody, but every piece was owned by somebody, even though California had been a state since 1850. Daniel H. Berman, famous for building skyscrapers and helping Chicago rebuild after the Great Fire, was selected to head up the project. If you read the book Devil in the White City, you'll learn all about him. George Davis was Director General, Berman Director of Works. Frederick Law Olmsted not only designed Central Park in New York City, but the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, UC Berkeley, Stanford U, University of Chicago, which was later built on the grounds of what used to be the White City, and the U.S. Capitol building. He was called the father of landscape architecture. Most importantly, he designed Jackson Park, where the committee had chosen as the site for the fair. He was already familiar with the area. They had, in 1870, decided that they were going to make this scrubby area Jackson Park. So they hired Olmsted. He got 3 areas put together. In the north, you had Washington Park, a midway area in between the 2 parks. Washington Park is at the upper left. Jackson Park is at the lower right. Midway in between 2 of them was a thing called the plaisance, or a pleasant place to walk in French. They had them in France. Plaisance. They called this the Midway Plaisance. Later, you're going to hear very famous part of theme parks and fairs was named after that, the Midway Plaisance. What do you think?
The Midway. Now, this is 1870 when they start constructing, or they give him the project to fix up these parks, make them nice.
Just finish up the parks. And then the Great Fire happened.
Oh, so when did they get the contract to do the exposition?
1880.
So they had...
No, 1890, sorry.
So in 1870, they already know what they're going to do with the land. They start work on it.
They know it's going to be a park.
But then the Great Fire happens.
And they lost all their funding. Oh. So you had the layout.
Right.
The rough layout. You had canals, some of them. They were meant to be canals through the Midway, but they were never built. It does get quite muddy.
Uh-huh.
So the students of University of Chicago call it the Mudway Nuisance.
So then the fire happens, destroys a lot of the city. The reconstruction cuts into any budget that they hope to have.
Yeah.
Then they get the contract for the expo, which is going to help with rebuilding Chicago.
The contract that they held with the city, this was 7 miles outside of the center of Chicago. Mm-hmm. The contract that they held with the city stated very clearly that the park must be returned to park status at the end of the exposition.
Okay.
We'll see that later when we see the statue being burned down and things like that. Mm-hmm. At the end. Tragic. The 200 or so buildings were temporary, so it had to be easy to return Jackson Park to the fair. Jackson Park would be the main area of the fair. The Midway Plaisance was set for the less dignified, the streets of Cairo, things like that. Mm-hmm. Remember, we talked about the streets of Cairo.
Mm-hmm. So they moved it over from Paris.
Mm-hmm. There were some controversies with the fair. There was Henry Mudgett, a.k.a. H.H. Holmes, who was America's first serial killer, had a murder hotel not too far from the fair, and he would lure single women going to the fair to stay in his hotel and would murder them in all sorts of different ways.
Oh, wow.
And dispose of his body in the crematorium in the basement. Mm-hmm. That's about all I'm going to talk about with him, but if you want a great book, The Devil in the White City, the chapters switch between Daniel Burnham, who created the fair, mm-hmm. and Henry Mudgett, the serial killer, mm-hmm. based on his extremely lengthy confession. It's a heck of a read, and it's something that I leaned on heavily to put together podcasts.
Okay. And the timeline for when everything happened.
Really good timeline, yeah. No African American pavilion was planned. They had a women's pavilion, but black people in the U.S. were supposedly equal, but not really. Most African American representation was on packages of new inventions, cream of wheat, and Aunt Jemima's pancake mix at the fair. Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Irvin Holland Dean, and Ferdinand Lee Barnett put together a pamphlet called The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition, the Afro-Americans' Contribution to Columbian Literature. Douglass and Wells said in the pamphlet, when it is asked why we are excluded from the World's Columbian Exposition, the answer is slavery. George Washington Carver was the only, they had a sculptor, but George Washington Carver was the only name we know of, other than Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells that we found at the fair. And he was actually there showing off a painting he did.
So not even to do anything with his inventions or his agriculture. It was because he was an artist.
This was a couple years before he went to the University of Tuskegee, or back as it was known back then, the Tuskegee Institute. He became the head of agriculture there.
So he was just an artist then. He was a young artist.
He saved agriculture in the South. They knew about crop rotation, but with the certain crops, cowpeas, the peanuts,
right.
He put out 101 recipes for peanuts.
Well, you can broil them, fricassee them, fry them. No, that was shrimp. That was shrimp.
But if you've ever been to the South and you've had boiled peanuts put into your RC Cola, it's delicious, and that's something that started with George Washington Carver, who got his start at the fair. Haiti President Florville Hippolyte, I'm getting this from livinginhistoryofillinois.com, let Frederick Douglass and company use the Haiti Pavilion as a default African American pavilion. They handed out copies of the flyer. They printed 20,000 copies. They handed out 10,000, and the other 10,000 they sent to anyone who would send them 3 pennies. To cover the postage. Haiti was the only autonomous black exhibition after the Civil War in the White City proper, not the Midway Plaisance. So it wasn't the exotic savages of Haiti. It was
an actual dedicated pavilion.
An actual dedicated pavilion that showed arts and crafts and statuary and things like that. But also, people were dressed like normal people. You got to meet Frederick Douglass, man. That would have been so cool. He was about 75 then. The women's building refused black women at first, but in the second half of the fair, it was allowed, and they had part of an upstairs area. Once the pamphlet was released, they received answers from the delegations of England, Germany, France, Russia, and India. So it was taken very seriously. It was also taken seriously by the people who ran the fair. It was a large slap in the face to them. Can't say it wasn't deserved.
Yeah. How can you be organizers of an exposition in the United States and cut out a good portion of your population from even having any sort of representation? That is a big insult to this country that's supposed to be showing where they are in the world and denying a large part of that to even exist or be presented to the world. So I'm glad the pamphlet got some momentum and made the U.S. and the organizers recognize that no, you have to acknowledge the contributions of the African Americans.
They decided to make up for this by having Negro Day
At the expo.
At the exposition. This was a good idea at first. Then they decided, in their wisdom, that they would be handing out 2,000 free watermelons that day.
Oh, yeah, I'm not surprised. As the listeners have noticed, I try to put sort of period correct music in the background of each episode. So in the earliest episodes, you've heard music that was sort of medieval. And then in the more recent ones, sort of music that was a little bit more contemporary to that era, the late 1800s. When I was gathering music for this sort of portion of history, it's under fair use because the copyright has long since expired on the recordings. And I had tons of music to choose from. Unfortunately, half, if not more than half of the library that I could select from was mostly minstrel music. So even the titles I wouldn't dare to repeat on this podcast, but you can imagine that was popular culture. That was popular music of the era. So all of these negative stereotypes were being pushed as entertainment, as accurate representations of black people and minorities of the era. So that what we see now as lampooning and insulting, back then they thought, oh, well, this is just the way they are, and these are the things they love. And so if we want to show that we care about the black people in America, well, let's give everybody the food that they love the most. As ill-advised as you can imagine as that gesture would be today, they completely didn't see it. Not that I'm apologizing for them, because that was pretty low.
That was pretty low. One good thing about music and the exposition is that it brought us ragtime. The day did not go badly, actually, despite the stupidity. Douglas gave a speech to 2,500 people, and it was a set speech. It was patterned very much after the pamphlet, which is a fascinating read if you want to go online and read it. It's heartbreaking, but it's a very good read. He got a heckler yelling about the Negro problem, and he put his notes aside and gave a hell of a speech. It's online, just a firestorm. Mm-hmm. One of his best speeches ever, and he gave great speeches.
So you're telling me that angry people, probably on the right, were talking about the Negro problem in Chicago more than 100 years ago. Wow, how few things have changed where that's still a talking point for certain party members.
It is. It's really sad to see. On the Midway Plaisance, they had human zoos type exhibits. It had originally planned to have that be a bazaar of nations, where you go through the different...
Bazaar of nations, not bizarre of nations.
Yeah, bazaar, B-A-Z-A-A-R, of nations. And you would go through and see all these different cultures. That didn't quite work out. They had a bunch of outdoor vendors and bars, the streets of Cairo. And what they did have was these human zoos and villages. At the far end was the least civilized, supposedly, going all the way forward to the most civilized, which was closest to the white city and white American culture. You see how it went? The streets of Cairo. We're going to talk about the streets of Cairo again. Saul Bloom produced it. He later became one of the founders of the United Nations. He went from one of the most racist caricatures of humanity to
helping put together an actual association of different nations and nationalities. Well, I suppose if you're going to caricature a people, you have to, one, visit the place, see exactly what you're either caricaturing or satiring or even making fun of, and then recognizing, hey, wait a minute, all of these people have a shared humanity, and maybe we shouldn't be poking fun at the differences, but celebrating the things we have in common as well.
Yeah.
That's how I think it happened.
The star of the streets of Cairo was a dancer named Farida Mazar Spyropoulos, who was actually from Greece, but she was
of Algerian descent?
No, she was Syrian.
Ah, okay.
In 1881, she started dancing at the famous Birdcage Theater in Tombstone, Arizona. There is a replica of it at Knott's Berry Farm.
That's right next to the school.
Right next to the schoolhouse, that's right. And there's a machine in the lobby that plays music, but usually it just eats the quarters.
Right.
But on the side of the machine, facing the outside, there's a little hole. If you put your finger in there, you can always find 3 or 4 quarters.
Well, you're giving away the game now.
I'm giving away the game. See, it pays to listen to this podcast. She posed for a painting that is there now at the one in Arizona, which has 6 bullet holes and a knife gash in it that have been repaired. She was in a show called The Rocks Dancers and the Algerian Dancers of Morocco. Not the Algerian Dancers of Algeria, the Algerian Dancers of Morocco, and not the Moroccan Dancers of Morocco.
Now this is Little Egypt.
Little Egypt. She was neither Egyptian, nor Algerian, nor Moroccan, but rather Syrian. They had snake charmers, so they had her theme song was called The Snake Charmer, and it was written by Saul Bloom, who we heard about earlier, and it goes like this.
I will sing you a song, and it won't be very long, about a maiden sweet, and she never would do wrong. Everyone said she was pretty, she was not.
So you people have probably been hearing this version of this song for decades now. Popularly, a lot of you know it as the Arabian Riff. You've heard it in The Simpsons, you've heard it in the classic Warner Brothers cartoons. So that actually started thanks to the streets of Cairo, and more specifically, thanks to Little Egypt.
And the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893.
So we have them to thank for this big piece of culture that still exists to this day.
She was billed as Fatima, and like I said, she was from Greece. She was married to a Chicago restaurateur. They called the dance she did the Hoochie Coochie, which we will find out in St. Louis when we meet them there, that name stuck. It was later called belly dancing, and they did it at Epcot Center for a while. Until just a couple years ago when Morocco pulled out and Disney took over the pavilion. It used to have all these little shops. You'd go through the Medina, the marketplace. They'd have around nooks and crannies. They'd have these little shops where you go in and you'd buy authentic Moroccan goods made in Morocco. I got Alice an incense burner there in 2015. She loved it until she got her asthma. After the fair, she went to Europe, and a new Little Egypt named Ashia Wabe emerged. And she was in New York and did the Dance of the Seven Veils. Have you heard of the Dance of the Seven Veils?
Yeah, wasn't that one of the early things? Now, did Edison record Fatima, or the second person that was going by this hoochie, not the hoochie coochie, but the Little Egypt gimmick?
Oh, I believe he recorded Farida. Because it was at the fair. You're going to see a recurring thing of all these World's Fairs that Thomas Edison is at almost all of them recording.
Yeah.
So any recordings that we have of these fairs, thank Thomas Edison. Like when I was studying for the Flow Fair in 1901, there's Thomas Edison. This Little Egypt did the Dance of the Seven Veils and took it quite literally. She was going to do the Dance of the Seven Veils and emerge fully nude, except for her veil around her face.
That would have been the eighth veil.
That would have been the eighth veil. But the police came and busted the party before she got her third veil off.
Now, this was in New York, not in Chicago.
This was in New York, not in Chicago. But Fatima came forward and said, I'm the real Little Egypt, and her reputation was saved.
But the good thing is, for those that are into the modern burlesque, this is where the seeds of all of this are planted. 1893. In
1933, 50 years later, at the Century of Progress Expo in Chicago, Farida danced, and she was 62 years old at the time, and apparently she was just beautiful. There was also Fatima de Gillette, claimed to be the one from 1893. She was not. They made a film called Little Egypt, highly fictitious, and when at the time of her death, the real Little Egypt was in the middle of suing them over it. And that comes from Flynn, the official guide to Midway Plaisance, and World's Fair Chicago 1893.com. The worst living zoo was Dahomey, which is now called Benin. They also had Java, Egypt, we talked about. Turkey. They had an Irish village. They had a German village. They had a Wienerwurst house in the German village. And a Triaca restaurant. Triaca, I couldn't find anything German having to do with Triaca, but I found that it's an Italian wine. So Make sense of that. They had Hindu, Hindoo, jugglers. They had an Aztec Indian village, a Chinese village, theater, and Joss House, which is a temple that a lot of white people like to visit when they're in China, at least back in the day. They had a Hungarian cafe and concert pavilion, a Japanese bazaar, Malaysian bungalow and village. They had a Lapland village. They had a Moorish palace. They had a natatorium, so you could take off your long dress and go swimming.
Not a pool.
No, a natatorium.
Natatorium.
And they had a Vienna bakery. Now, what we call French pastries, the French call Vienna pastries.
Oh.
And in Chicago at the time, they were called Vienna pastries.
Okay.
But now everyone calls them French pastries, and they're actually from Vienna. They had an ostrich farm, and ostriches were very popular back then. Do you know why?
Big eggs, and they tasted really good.
They do taste really good. No, the women were wearing the big feathers in their hats.
Oh, yeah.
Those were
fashion
ostrich
of the
feathers. Yeah. They were just starting to become in fashion now, but by the 1900s and 1910s, they had ostrich farms all over California.
I think there's still a few.
There's still a few. There's one out by the San Diego Safari Park, and you can actually buy eggs there. And then there's a meat shop near my sister, that red one, and they sell ostrich meat there. I used to stop there when I was teaching on the Indian reservations, and I would get ostrich meat and bring it home, and everybody loved it. Some other things they had were the panorama of the Bernese Alps, Bernesese, not Burmese. Bernese, like from Bern, Switzerland. They had a Persian palace and a Persian theater and a bazaar. Now, people of this time loved to see reenactments of disasters like the Jonestown flood. Here they had a Pompeii theater and panorama called The Last Days of Pompeii. They had Sitting Bull's cabin. They had a South Sea Islands village, which kind of like Moana was vaguely Samoan and vaguely Fijian, and they had a St. Bernard dog show. They had streets in Cairo. They had an Egyptian Luxor temple there, like the one in Las Vegas, but without gambling. Something else they had at the streets of Cairo, and something you and I have both done, camel rides.
Oh, so not only did they actually bring over building fronts or facades from Cairo to recreate like we had said, it's sort of like the Diagon Alley, but using actual things from Egypt. They also brought in the Egyptian animals for
They did. They had the San Diego Wild Animal Park, as it was called back then. It's the Safari Park now. And they got rid of the monorail, so I don't want to go. But they used to have elephant and camel rides, and I did both of those. And at the fair, you could ride a camel for $50. No, 50 cents.
Well, since nobody could afford $50 back then, maybe the Rockefellers could, but not the regular people.
Also, they had a Turkish village, a U.S. Customs Department office.
Well, they had to get the clearance to bring in all of these animals and stuff.
And also the things that you bought from the bazaar and stuff and wanted to take home to Europe. They had Venice and Murano Island Company, which they had some small canals and boatmen that would take you around. But actually, I'll talk about it more later. No, I'll talk about it now. In the White City, there was a series of canals that Olmsted had originally intended for the park that were used for the fair. And there were two ways to get around if you didn't feel like walking. And that was electric friendship boats, like the ones at EPCOT, sort of. And then they had gondoliers in gondolas. And they said that the gondoliers came straight from Venice. And they would row you around the different parts of the fair and sing to you. One of my favorite things to study from the fair was the volcano of Kilauea. You would go into this cyclorama, a round building, very much like the Circle Vision Theater at Disneyland. You would go in and you stand in the middle, and you're standing on a red volcano, and all around you is the volcano and the island, as if you were standing in the middle of the volcano, and you could see everything. One of my other favorite things that they had there, in addition to the exotic villages, they had the working man's model home, and it showed what an average Chicago workman lived like, which I thought was interesting.
Well, for international visitors, it gives them the chance to understand, well, these are how the working class in the U.S. live.
Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't Chicago, it was Philadelphia.
Oh, well, to a lesser extent, the people of Philadelphia, see how they work.
They had Bulgarian curiosities and a Brazil exhibit. They had a captive balloon ride around the Midway. This was like the one in France that we talked about, where you'd go up. About 3/4 of the way through the fair, the wind caught the balloon and crashed it, and it didn't work anymore, unfortunately. But one of the more useful things they had gold mining, like you have at Knott's, where you pan for gold, and they had a diamond match company, which everyone was using matches to light their stove and light their gas lights and everything. So that was a very popular exhibit. One of my favorite things was the Eiffel Tower model. You could go into a building for 25 cents. You could go into a building, and there was a model of the Paris exhibition that we just talked about, and a lit up Eiffel Tower, and you could go and see the lit up Eiffel Tower model.
And this was order scale?
Doesn't say. It was, well, the Eiffel Tower is huge. It's over 1,000 feet tall.
Exactly. So how big was this model?
From the photos, it looks to be about 5 feet tall.
Okay, well, that's a pretty good scale. And it gives you a sense as to how big the previous World's Exposition was.
Exactly. They had an electric scenic theater where they played a rough animation, kind of a precursor to animation. And Zoopraxicographical Hall, which was another precursor to film. But the zoopraxicographical device didn't catch on like Edison's did. Let's talk about the Ferris wheel at the end of the Midway Plaisance. They were trying to figure out how to outdo the Eiffel Tower and make it, they said they'd make it spin. And some people say that Ferris said that it was his idea. He saw it from a bicycle wheel and from a water wheel near his house. And Burnham said it was his idea, and he gave it to Ferris to make.
So the history is a little bit clouded.
The history is a little bit clouded. They made the wheel, and it was a success, and we're going to talk about it at length in our Mechanics of Magic chapter.
Okay.
But I will say that George Washington Ferris died at the age of 37, never knowing that his Ferris wheel caught on.
I'm pretty sure he at least had a good sense as to how important this would be, because if the Eiffel Tower was one of the 7 wonders of the world, the fact that he built something that was equally as tall but could actually move is nothing to sneeze at. I mean, he must have known he built another one of the wonders of the world. Sorry that he had to die so young.
On October 9th, also known as Chicago Day, 751,026 people made their way through the gates. The debt for the fair was paid off soon after, $1.5 million, which is about $49 million now. Chicago now had 3 stars on its city flag, one for the establishment of Fort Dearborn, one for the Great Fire of 1871, and one for the World's Columbian Exposition. A 4th was added in 1933 for the Century of Progress Exposition. So the city of Chicago flag now has 4 stars. The White City was what people called the main part of the fair, not the Midway Plaisance, but the White City was the main part of the fair with all the official buildings and stuff, because it was all white, except for one building.
So up until now, everything you just discussed, the villages from other countries, the Ferris wheel,
that was all the Midway Plaisance.
That was all Midway Plaisance, the park area.
Mm-hmm.
So we haven't even gotten to the actual expo buildings.
We haven't gotten to Jackson Park at all.
Oh wow, this place is huge and beautiful at this point.
Yeah, the Midway Plaisance also had bars and saloons and other dancing girls. Mm-hmm. They had dancing girls from France.
Tons of entertainment.
Just tons of entertainment. And it was, sadly, the most popular part of the fair. As beautiful as the White City itself was.
Yeah, well, the White City didn't have a skin show.
It didn't have beer.
Sorry to hear that.
The White City Planning Office was set up in a nearby skyscraper, the Rand McNally building. Rand McNally also had a presence in the fair, inside the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building. Mm-hmm. Remember when I talked about staff?
Right, the material that they were making this, the facades of, that was easy to work with. You could sculpt with it. It looked like marble. It could hold texture if you textured it, but it was highly flammable too.
Exactly. There were 12,000 construction workers. There was a budget half the size of the Paris Exposition.
So they did all of this with a budget half as big as Paris?
Half as big.
Wow. Okay.
The buildings were Roman imperial style, not Roman Roman Republican. Very important to know that. The cornice height in all the classical buildings was 60 feet. Cornice is the edge that pokes out on the corners and the sides of Roman-style buildings.
So every building was at least 60 feet tall.
Almost all of the designers for the fair went to school at the École des Beaux-Arts, School of Fine Arts, in Paris, France.
The Beaux Arts style that
The
had
Beaux-Arts style,
Okay,
that's
it's all
exactly
coming back.
it.
So this is their major exposure in the U.S. because they had influenced things overseas, and now it's starting to influence things here.
Right, and you could visit the construction site and watch it being built for 25 cents.
Sure, that helped them get back some of their money.
It did. Not just carpenters, but day laborers, iron forgers, architects, trackmen, painters, glazers, designers, molders, joiners, sculptors, men of every trade and handicraft, and some women too.
Okay. Well, they had about less than 3 years to get everything up and running at a scale that's less than the budget that they had in Paris, so they couldn't spare any time.
They only had about a year. They didn't start construction until the year before.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, it was really
They got it
rushed and on half the budget. Hundreds of people worked on constructing the fair, but let's just look at one, a carpenter named Elias Disney. I found this in a genealogical book called A Story of Disney, Some Myth Exploded by William Disney. There's a picture of Elias at the fair by an entrance door to one of the alabaster buildings. He and his wife Flora welcomed a son around this time. Completely enamored of the fair, Elias wanted to name their new son Columbus, a popular baby name at the time in Chicago. Florida vetoed it, and they ended up naming their son Roy, and we never heard from that family again.
Huh. I wonder whatever happened to it. Well, at least Mr. Elias was remembered for his contribution to the White City. God bless that man.
We know that Elias regaled his children with stories of the White City and the Midway Plaisance. Historians say that Elias not only built the city, but he attended the fair as well. And I think this photo is evidence of that, because the city is finished and he's not dressed in work clothes.
Oh, that's true. Plus, it's not like the workmen of that era could afford to have a photographer take a picture of them like we do now, where everybody has a camera in their pocket and you can take selfies on the construction site.
And you weren't allowed to take cameras into the White City unless you paid $2.
Yeah, so this photograph is a souvenir photograph for him and his family.
There's a site called White City Influence on DisneyParks.wordpress.com that helped me a little bit with this. Historians keep saying that Elias told his sons about the fair. I believe Walt mentioned it, but I couldn't find any place where he did. But I remember him mentioning it. But I could be having a Mandela memory.
Maybe, or maybe he did mention it. And we'll find the article one of these days. But if you're a listener and you have the article, let us know.
You can buy a pin of Elias and Flora's house in front of the Ferris wheel at the Walt Disney Birthplace, waltdisneybirthplace.org. Elias wasn't the only one influenced by the fair. L. Frank Baum said he based the Emerald City in Oz on the White City. And the thing we'll hear more of later is a quote by Daniel Burnham, head of the fair: "Make no small plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." All the buildings were this beautiful white Roman style, Greek style, classical buildings except for one, the transportation building. David Burnham started designing the White City with his partner John Rook, who died suddenly early in planning. His widow kept in touch with Burnham, and his letters were among the things when she died in Pasadena in 1945. And it really gave people an insight into what Burnham was going through designing the fair. The White City was 14 buildings, all alabaster white except one. The architect of the transportation building, Louis Sullivan, was furious that the fair had adopted the Beaux Arts style. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you know what the Beaux Arts style is. Daniel Burnham even designed Union Station in Washington, D.C. Sullivan made the transportation building, which was set back from the Court of Honor so you couldn't see it at first, an Art Deco masterpiece with a golden door of multiple inset arches that was the talk of the fair. Have you seen the Golden Door? Have you seen the Golden Door? Long Beach City College had doors like this that were painted red, but they got rid of them in the last redo.
Right.
It's a shame.
Yeah. So he was actually spearheading the next evolution of architecture and design, Art Deco.
Right.
And so he was like, yeah, Beau's nice, but check this out.
Exactly. And he was 30 or 40 years ahead ahead of his time.
Absolutely.
The transportation building had Daniel Webster's carriage, President Taft's car, which was all beat up. President Taft was remembered mainly for one thing. He was so fat they had to make him a special bathtub. The bathtub was not displayed at the fair. They had bicycles, sleighs, locomotives, and rail cars from all the European countries. They had models of steamships and naval battleships. They had a masonite replica of the ill-fated Victoria, which cost over $50,000 to build at that time, and you had to have a staircase so people could climb up to look at the upper decks. The building had a locomotive, boats, horseless and horse-drawn carriages, sans horses, no horses in the building. There was a very popular pavilion at the fair. One of the main buildings was the refrigerator building. A fire tore through the staff and wood building, killing 13 firemen and 4 co-workers who were trapped inside the windowless building. All but 2 jumped to their death.
Oh, no.
They tried to escape on the top, and the building was so tall, the firemen's ladders couldn't reach them.
Right.
They found 2 charred bodies on the rooftop, so altogether 17 dead. The proceeds from the following Sunday were divided among their families, leaving them moderately well off for the time. Approximately $50,000 for each family.
Yeah, but that's a small consolation.
That's a small consolation for losing the breadwinner of your family, but at least it means you're not going to starve.
Yeah, oh, poor people.
The electrical building was the heart of the fair. Inside this building were the motors that generated everything in the fair proper, not the Midway Plaisance. That was a different building. Unfortunately, it was so loud, anyone who entered had to immediately leave because of the hellish noise. The building workers worked short shifts because the amount of noise might deafen them and also might drive them insane. Krupp's once again had a building that, while not part of the German pavilion, represented Germany's military very well. They had, among other things, a gun that could shoot a 2-ton projectile 15 miles. The U.S. had a gun that could shoot a 1-ton projectile 30 miles, so they were catching up. Schofield, who the barracks in Hawaii were named after, said the best way to guarantee peace is to be ready for war. I wish someone had told Kaiser Wilhelm that. Harper's Bazaar told women to dress in dark colors and simply so people, especially foreigners, would think that they were rich. The largest building of the fair was the Manufacturers, there's that word again, and Liberal Arts Building. It has a grand walkway that would fit 300,000 people standing fingertip to fingertip, arms outstretched. There were so many booths, they were never counted, thought to be somewhere in the 10,000s. Fashion, lace, perfumed fountain, you dip your handkerchief in and they change the perfume every day in the France Pavilion.
Wow.
Or the France section.
C'est magnifique.
C'est magnifique. Germany had dolls and mechanical toys, a cow that would moo and a sheep that would jump. Italy had wine. Tiffany had a silver-encrusted toilet. Do not have breakfast at the silver-encrusted toilet.
No.
They showed off something new called fire extinguishers. It was the largest building in the world at the time. It was about twice the size of the Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic.
So this is the manufacturing building?
Manufacturers.
Manufacturers building.
And liberal arts.
Wow, that's a big building.
Chicagoology.com says the building covered 32 acres, which is about 1/3 of the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World.
So they had one building that covered 1/3 of the Magic Kingdom? And they built it in less than a year?
Yep.
Holy smoke.
It was built of steel, iron, and staff. And wood. Of course. It was 212 feet and 9 inches at the center of the roof, 4 times as large as the Colosseum in Rome. It had no supporting pillars inside!
Wow.
The entrance was 80 feet high and 40 feet wide. It cost $1.7 million back then to build. 17 million feet of lumber, 12 million pounds of steel, 2 million pounds of iron. There were 4 main entrances. At each corner of the building was a pavilion. You could take an Otis elevator to the roof for 25 cents, and they had a chain link fence around the edge of the roof so you wouldn't fall off, and a couple big searchlights up there, and you could stand there and you could see the Court of Honor on one side, and you could see the Ferris wheel way over there, and look down and see the lagoons, and people would stand there for hours and wait until the lights came on and then look at all the lights.
Oh wow. Because this is also the first large-scale deployment of lights like that. So previously in the other
in America,
but overseas we talked about how in England there were the lamps, there were the gas lamps. That was the first chance for a lot of people from the country to see that, and then they started putting the precursor to the gel colors. There were fabric color lights, so then there were walkways of lights. But then in the US you have acres and acres of these gorgeous white buildings, and then they're all illuminated at night
with electrical lights.
Now,
cities like Chicago and New York had lights downtown,
right?
But on the inside, they still used gas lamps,
right? And this was out in a park in the middle,
right? The United States section of the inside of the building had vaults, safes, hardware, furniture, firearms, ammunition, scales, weights and measures, chemicals, perfuming and toilet articles, woolen goods and mixed textiles, ceramics and mosaics, monuments like in graveyards, fountains, ornamental iron, furs, art metal works, refrigerators, heating and cooling apparatus, enameled ware, sanitary goods, gas fixtures, wallpapers, interior decorations, gold, silver and plateware, silk goods and cotton goods, and a lot more.
Well, this is the U.S. showing off everything that the U.S. could do.
Exactly. There were also Japan, France, Germany, Belgium, Great Britain, Canada, India, New South Wales, Jamaica, Argentine Republic, Italy, Denmark, Brazil, Switzerland, Spain, Turkey, Korea, Monaco, Bulgaria, Portugal, Norway, Mexico, Siam, which is Thailand, Persia, which is Iran, Netherlands, China, Russia, and Australian exhibitors inside the building. And then you had various universities and schools, even some kindergartens. Rand McNally was here. They had blind schools, trade schools, women's medical college, etc. Architecture, medicine, and law schools all represented. There were 6 miles of pathways outside to traverse, but you could hire someone to push you in a luxurious wheelchair for 75 cents an hour.
But those weren't like the medical wheelchairs that we have.
No, they were big wicker chairs with footrests.
Sort of like the people if you go to like downtown San Diego, and they have the people with the bicycle carts, similar business.
Oh, I forgot something from the Midway Plaisance. Thomas Rankin's Snow and Ice Railway, a Russian railway, which we'll talk more about in the Mechanics of Magic episode. But electricity kept huge blocks of ice frozen, and guests would slide down them. As a precursor to the roller coaster.
Right.
And they'd have the bunny hops, and they'd be on carts and blankets. After the fair, it moved to Coney Island for a while.
Oh.
Then it melted. But back to the White City. In the White City, on the Midway Plaisance, you could take an electrical launch through the extensive series of canals throughout the White City, or be romantic and hire a gondola. There was a great basin. As you came in, there was the motorized walkway, the people mover.
Right.
Most of the time it didn't work. Paris got it working, though.
Okay.
But for the White City, most people walked up the pier, past the casino, and through the Peristyle, which was a big Arc de Triomphe flanked by 48 for the states and territories. 48 columns in this beautiful building. And then just on the other side of that is the Court of Honor, the Great Basin, a huge body of water. At the end of the basin was a statue with maidens piloting a boat with horses that had mermaid butts. Tails.
Yeah, horses with fishtails.
With fishtails. Above the peristyle was a statue of explorers. As you came in, you came to the back of a huge woman standing on a pedestal in the middle of the water. Not in the middle of the water, on the end of the water, but she was standing in the water. A huge pedestal, and then a 625-foot statue called the Republic, and it was Columbia, who we've seen in statuary.
Yeah, I love the Statue of Columbia. Every time I think of Columbia, I think of Liberty, and I think of those old, odd Victorian, Roman era bow style that never quite existed, the fashion that we still see on the seals in like the courts and stuff. And I think what an interesting comic that would make of like who were the goddesses or the heroes before Wonder Woman. And I always think like Columbia and Liberty were like the heroes before Wonder Woman.
Yeah, absolutely. Where I grew up in Hawaii, we had Punch Bowl Cemetery, and when you stand at the entrance of Punch Bowl Cemetery and look straight down at the grand building at the very bottom, Columbia is there. and it looks like she's holding things of peace. When you get right underneath her and look up, she has the most terrible expression. She's terrifying, and she's mourning the war dead there.
Mm-hmm.
Always a big fan of Columbia, and they called the statue Big Mary. She was gilded, except for the parts of her that would be her skin, her face and neck and arms and hands were not gilded, but the rest of her was gilded, and quite a sight. In her right hand she held an orb, and in her left hand she held a long staff or spear.
Right, that's how I always remember.
And you can't tell whether it was a staff or spear because there's a hat over it.
Yeah, she had an armored helmet.
No, in this case, she had one of the hats that the French revolutionaries wore as a symbol of liberty.
Well, there it is.
Well, if they were the symbol of the American Revolutionary War, it'd be a tricorn, and it wouldn't look very good.
No, in this case it's like tyranny has been defeated. Long live Columbia, or in this case, Big Mary.
Oh, it's called a Phrygian cap or hat. On the spear is partially hidden by olive leaves. It's inscripted Liberty. They have a new one that was put up for the 100th anniversary. No, it was put up for the 50th anniversary of the fair, and it's about a third of the size. It's over by where the transportation building was.
And it's still there now?
It's still there now, about a third of the size, and it's completely gilded. It's all gilded.
Oh, wow.
It was gilded for the 100th anniversary of the fair, and it's actually in a roundabout.
And it's a accurate replica of the original one?
Pretty accurate. There's also one exactly like it at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Glendale, where Walt Disney is buried.
Oh, how nice.
Well, entombed. Oh, it presently stands between where the electricity and administration buildings stood, so not the transportation building. The original statue was destroyed by fire on August 28, 1894, by order of the city commissioners. It was made of staff, so it burned easily. It wouldn't have lasted anyway. Across the basin stood the administration building, which was modeled after the U.S. Capitol building. At the end of another lagoon stood the only permanent building, the Fine Arts Building. Insurers wouldn't cover the cost of the art inside, unless it was made fireproof. So staff was a no-go. It was made of brick, mortar, and steel, and then it was coated in staff. The parts done in staff had to be rebuilt in 1933 with more durable materials. Inside, the art was all kapakahi except for Japan's exhibit, which was neat and orderly. Every country had a room, and art was crammed in tightly. Pictures on pictures on pictures on pictures.
Oh, gosh.
Layered up the walls. There was no breathing room for any of the art. You know how you look at a piece of art in a museum and it's very calm and blank around it,
right?
So that you
a
can
chance to appreciate and focus,
get everything in context.
Right.
Not here.
You're flipping through a catalog of a million posters.
The middle part of the building had statuary, and they had statues less than 2 feet apart from each other because there was just so much.
It's some rich collectors just collection just all laid out there.
Exactly. People were so overwhelmed they left quickly, so there was never a long line, unlike other pavilions. What other pavilions? We'll talk about that next time. If you want to find more of my history articles, go to micechat.com or jimhillmedia.com. Noah?
If you want to find out more information about video games or the other topics that I write about, I'm available at the streetwriterpodcast.blogspot.com. If you search Street Writer Podcast, you'll also find me on YouTube. A special shout out to our sponsor, Circa 1955. Nicole is the founder of Luxillume, a small company that makes candles, wax melts, and room sprays. She creates scents that capture the season, nature, or wonderful memories. She also takes commissions for larger orders, such as weddings or company gifts. It turns out that Nicole is also a huge Disney fan and has a line called Circa 1955. She creates scents inspired by all things Disney. This includes the parks, attractions, treats, and films. She creates each formula and batch of candles herself. For every one scent she's released, she's probably made over 200 trials just to get the smell right. Don't take my word for it. Go to circa1955.com, order a candle, and use promo code PINK15. That's PINK15 to get 15% off your purchase. Support a small company that also gives back to the community. You're going to love it. Another shout out to Jim Hill for hosting Pink Monorail on his podcast network. The Jim Hill Podcast Network also includes Looking at Lucasfilm, The Disney Dish, I Want That, and Fine Tuning. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review for each podcast. Have a great day.